Hey everyone, before we dive into Maggie's story, the kind that sticks with you long after it's told, let me ask, have you ever heard something so chilling, so unforgettable that it changes the way you see everything? If you have, drop a comment below, let's talk. When I listened to the final message she left me, I couldn't breathe. The words she spoke before the fire consumed everything. They've haunted me ever since. I wasn't just her niece. She used to call me her shadow, the one who'd always follow her wherever she went. She was more than just family. She was my rock, second mom, and guiding light. Her name was Maggie Sinclair, and if you met her even once, you'd never forget her. But I wasn't there when she needed me most on that fateful night. I've replayed it 1,000 times, what I could have done differently, what I should have done. Maybe if I had stayed, things would be different. Perhaps she'd still be here, or maybe she was right. Maybe none of this was ever in my control. Maggie wasn't like most 75-year-olds. She lived alone in her little hillside cottage in Altadena, surrounded by pine trees and peace. Every morning she'd climb the trails near her home, a habit she'd picked up decades ago. Keeps the spirit young, she'd always say. She hosted her book club every Friday, serving tea and pastries she made from scratch. She wasn't just alive, she was vibrant, strong, unstoppable. She made you believe everything would be okay, even when life felt like it was falling apart. But that's what makes this so much more complex. Because even in her final moments, Maggie held on to hope, and then there were her final words. Words that still send shivers down my spine, her voice, the things she said, it was as if she knew something no one else did. As if she'd seen what was coming before anyone else could. It wasn't just a goodbye, it was something more, a warning, a plea, and now every time I think about it, I wonder, was there something she was trying to tell me? Something I missed. It started as an ordinary evening. The kind of night Maggie loved. She'd lit her favorite vanilla-scented candle, the one she always said made her home feel warm no matter what. She put on a Miles Davis record and curled up with the latest mystery novel her book club was reading. She was happy, content, but as the Santa Ana winds began to howl outside, something shifted. At first it was subtle, the faintest scent of smoke. Maggie thought it was nothing. Fires weren't new to her, they happen all the time in California. They always stay in the distance, she told me once. The mountains take care of us. That night she was wrong. As the flames crept closer, Maggie realized this wasn't just another fire. The winds were fierce, carrying embers that danced in the air like fireflies. When she stepped outside, the horizon was glowing a fiery orange. It was beautiful in the most terrifying way. She called me at 9:47 p.m. I didn't pick up. I was busy, thinking it could wait until morning. It couldn't. Her final message wasn't a phone call. It was a voice note. A desperate, heartfelt recording she left just minutes before the fire reached her door. Maggie's voice crackles over the audio. If you're hearing this, I love you, don't be sad, but there's something you need to know. She paused. For a moment I thought the message had ended. But then, in a voice that didn't sound like hers, lower, heavier, she whispered, the winds, they're carrying something. Something that shouldn't be here. Listen to them, don't ignore them. What did she mean? The winds carrying what? I've replayed that message hundreds of times. I've asked everyone I know, firefighters, scientists, spiritual leaders, what it could mean. Some say it's just the ramblings of someone in distress. Others think it was a premonition, a warning. But here's the thing. Maggie was the calmest person I knew. She didn't panic, not even in the worst situations. So why did she sound so terrified? Whatever she meant by her final words, they'll haunt me forever. And the worst part, I'll never get the chance to ask her. This is her story, and this is what she left behind. Meet the victim, Margaret Maggie Sinclair. If you ever met Margaret Maggie Sinclair, you'd never forget her. At 75, she was the kind of woman who made you question everything you thought you knew about growing older. Fiercely independent and endlessly vibrant, Maggie lived alone in a charming hillside cottage in Altadena, California. But don't let the word alone mislead you. Maggie's life was anything but lonely. She wasn't your average retiree. Every morning, rain or shine, she'd lace up her hiking boots and head for the hills behind her home, navigating rugged trails as if they were her playground. It didn't matter if the sun was blazing or the winds were howling. Maggie climbed those trails like she had something to prove, even if it was only to herself. Her mornings were sacred, a ritual she never skipped, and every climb seemed to fuel her soul. By the afternoon, you'd find her in her backyard, easel set up under the shade of an old oak tree, paintbrush in hand. Maggie wasn't just a painter, she was an artist in every sense. Her landscapes captured the California hills' golden hues, the light hitting the trees just before sunset, and the fiery reds and oranges of autumn leaves. Her work wasn't just art, a love letter to the world she adored, and Friday nights, those belonged to her book club. Maggie's cozy cottage transformed into a laughter, debate, and storytelling hub. She'd bake her famous lemon scones and brew fresh tea, the aroma filling every corner of the house. Her book club wasn't just about books, it was about connection. People gravitated to her warmth, wisdom, and uncanny ability to make everyone feel like they belonged. A life full of quirks, Maggie had a way of turning the ordinary into the extraordinary. Her home was a reflection of her, filled with charm, character, and a touch of mystery. She had a ritual for everything, and you couldn't help but smile at her quirky habits. Every evening, without fail, she'd light a vanilla-scented candle on her coffee table. "It makes the house feel alive," she'd say with a wink. Soft jazz would play in the background, Miles Davis or Ella Fitzgerald, depending on her mood, and she'd curl up in her favorite armchair with a mystery novel. It was her quiet time, her way of winding down and recharging for the next day's adventures. She loved collecting wind chimes. They hung all around her porch, tinkling softly in the breeze. Each one had a story, a souvenir from her travels, a gift from a friend, or something she'd stumbled upon at a local flea market. "They sing the songs of the wind," she told me once, "and the wind has so much to say if you just listen." Maggie also had a habit of journaling. Every morning after her hike, she'd sit at her kitchen table, pen in hand, and jot down her thoughts. Sometimes they were simple observations about the weather or the flowers blooming in her garden. Other times they were reflections on life, love, and the mysteries of the universe. Her journals were filled with wisdom, humor, and the kind of insight you'd expect from someone who had truly lived. She was also a foodie. Maggie could make a gourmet meal from whatever she had in her pantry. Her kitchen was always stocked with fresh herbs, exotic spices, and the finest olive oil. She loved cooking for others, and her dinners were legendary. Her roasted chicken recipe to die for, and don't even get me started on her apple pie, her superstitions and mystical beliefs. But Maggie wasn't just about the tangible. She had a mystical side, adding a layer of intrigue to her already fascinating personality. She believed in the power of nature and often spoke about the language of the elements. For her, the wind wasn't just wind, the rain wasn't just rain. They were messengers, each carrying its secrets. She'd often say things like, "The winds carry stories from faraway places," or "Listen closely to the rustling leaves, they have something to tell you." At the time, I thought it was just her poetic way of seeing the world, but now, looking back, those words feel heavier, almost like a warning I didn't understand. Maggie also had a peculiar habit of keeping a jar of salt near every window in her house. "It keeps the bad energy out," she'd explain casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. She wasn't religious in the traditional sense, but had a deep spiritual connection to the earth, the sky, and everything in between. She'd often burn sage to cleanse the air or place crystals on her windowsill to charge them with moonlight. Her beliefs weren't preaky or overbearing. They were simply a part of who she was, a blend of old wisdom and childlike wonder. And whether or not you believed in her rituals, you couldn't deny that they added a certain magic to her presence. Hints of foreshadowing. Maggie's connection to nature wasn't just about admiration. It was almost as if she could sense things others couldn't. She had this way of knowing when a storm was coming long before the weather forecast. She'd say things like, "The air feels heavy today," or "The birds are quieter than usual." "Something's coming." One evening, as we sat on her porch watching the sunset, she said something I'll never forget. "Nature speaks louder than we listen," she told me, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "The winds, the trees, the animals, they all know what's coming before we do. We just don't pay attention." I thought it was just one of her philosophical musings at the time. But now, after everything that happened, I wonder if she knew more than she let on. Maybe she had sensed something that night, the night the fire came, the heart of Maggie Sinclair. What made Maggie truly unforgettable wasn't just her quirks or her hobbies, it was her heart. She had a way of making everyone feel special, like they mattered. She'd remember the little things, your favorite tea, the name of your childhood pet, the story you told her 3 years ago that even you'd forgotten. She listened, really listened, and she made you feel seen. Maggie was the kind of person who'd stop everything to help a friend in need. She'd drive for hours to rescue a stranded dog or spend weekends volunteering at the local library. She wasn't just kind but compassionate, generous, and fiercely loyal. Her life wasn't without its hardships. She'd lost her husband young and raised her 2 kids on her own. She knew what it meant to struggle, to fight, to endure, but she never let life's challenges harden her. Instead, they made her softer, more empathetic, more full of life. Why Maggie matters. Maggie Sinclair wasn't just another victim of a tragic fire. She was a force of nature, a light in the lives of everyone who knew her. Her story isn't just about loss, it's about love, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. And as I tell you more about that fateful night, you'll see why her final message wasn't just a goodbye. It was something much bigger, a glimpse into her mysterious connection with the world around her. Maggie always said, life is short, but it's beautiful if you look closely. And even in her last moments, she lived by those words. The day everything changed, it started like any other day in sunny Southern California. The kind of day where the sky stretched out in an endless blue canvas, unbroken by even a wisp of cloud. The air was warm, carrying that faint scent of blooming jasmine that always lingered in Maggie's backyard. Mama D, what we all called Maggie Sinclair, was up early as usual, the way she always was. Her routine seemed untouchable, as if it would go on forever. She brewed her morning tea, Earl Grey with almond milk, and stepped onto her porch to watch the sunrise over the hills. Another perfect day, she said with a smile, her voice carrying that familiar optimism that made you believe her. She sat in her wicker chair, her cat Shadow curling up at her feet, and opened her journal. Her pen moved effortlessly across the pages, capturing her thoughts on the crisp morning air and how the sunlight kissed the tops of the pine trees. It was a day so ordinary and peaceful that none of us saw what was coming. None of us realized it would be the last one we'd share with her. A ripple of unease. I was busy that morning, caught up in my usual routine, when I got a call from Maggie. Her voice was calm, cheerful even. She talked about the book she was reading and the painting she'd started the day before. I'm trying something new, she said. A fiery sunset over the hills. You'll have to come see it when I'm done. I promised I would. But even as she spoke, her words had a strange undercurrent. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a note out of tune in a familiar song. I shrugged it off. Maggie had always been poetic, sometimes cryptic. It was just her way. Later that morning, I got a text from a friend who lived nearby. Did you hear about the fire near the canyon? They're saying it's spreading fast. I paused, rereading the words, and felt a pang of unease. Fires weren't uncommon in our area, especially during the dry season, but this one felt different. The winds had been fierce the past few days, whipping through the hills like they had a mind. I called Maggie immediately. Hey, have you heard about a fire near the canyon? She was unfazed. Oh, I saw some smoke in the distance earlier. Nothing to worry about. Fires like that never make it this far. The hills protect us. Her confidence eased me, but only slightly. Just keep an eye on it, okay? She laughed. I always do. Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll call you if anything changes. Smoke on the horizon by mid-afternoon. The news was everywhere. What had started as a tiny brush fire had grown into a roaring beast, fanned by relentless Santa Ana winds. The flames were racing across the dry landscape, devouring everything in their path. I called Maggie again, my unease growing with every passing minute. This time, her voice wasn't relatively as steady. The winds picked up, she admitted, and the smoke's getting thicker, but it's still far off. The fire crews will handle it. I wanted to believe her. Maggie had lived in that house for over 30 years. She'd seen her share of wildfires, and they'd always stayed on the other side of the hills. But something about this one felt different. It felt angry, foreshadowing the unseen. The winds carried more than just smoke that day, an unsettling energy. Maggie had always talked about how the elements spoke to her, how nature had warned us if we just paid attention. The winds are restless, she'd say. They carry secrets. At the time, I thought it was just her poetic nature, the artist in her romanticizing the world. But as the day went on, her words came back to me, louder and more urgent. The winds were restless, carrying something far more dangerous than secrets. A growing sense of dread that evening. As the sun began to set, the sky turned a deep, unnatural orange. It wasn't the kind of fiery sunset Maggie loved to paint. It was something darker, more ominous. The smoke was closer now, swirling thick and fast, choking out the horizon. The air felt heavier, charged with electricity, as if the earth held its breath. I called Maggie again. Are you okay? I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound calm. I'm fine, she said, but her voice was quieter now, almost distant. I've been watching the fire from my window. It's beautiful in a way, terrifying but beautiful. Maggie, you need to think about leaving, I urged her. Just pack a bag and go. Don't wait until it's too late. There was a long pause before she answered. It's not time yet, she said softly. I'll know when it is. The last time I spoke to Maggie was just after 9 p.m. The fire was closer than ever, the winds howling like a wild animal outside her windows. I begged her to leave, but she wouldn't. I've lived here my whole life, she said. This house, these hills, they're part of me. I can't just abandon them. I didn't know it then, but we ran out of time. Every moment I spent trying to convince her to leave was lost. The fire wasn't waiting. It was coming, fast and merciless. Night falls that night. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stared at the ceiling, replaying our conversations repeatedly, wishing I'd said more and pushed harder. At some point I drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of smoke and fire. I woke to a call at 2:17 a.m. It was my friend from Altadena. Her voice was shaking. "The fires hit the canyon," she said. "It's bad, really bad. Have you heard from Maggie?" My heart dropped. I threw on my clothes and grabbed my keys, my hands trembling as I started the car. The drive to Altadena felt like an eternity. The roads were eerily empty, the sky an angry orange red. Every breath tasted of smoke, and every turn in the road filled me with dread. Foreshadowing fulfilled as I approached Maggie's street, the sight stopped me. Flames licked the edges of her property, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The wind howled, carrying the crackling of fire and the distant wail of sirens. Her house was still standing, but the fire was closing in. I called her one last time, but it went straight to voicemail. The message she left me earlier that night would be the last I'd heard her voice. Looking back now, I can see all the signs. The restless winds, the heavy air, the way Maggie spoke as if she knew something I didn't. It was all there, but I didn't see it. Not until it was too late. The day had started so peacefully, so predictably. But it ended in a way none of us could have imagined, and Maggie's final message. It was the beginning of a mystery I'm still trying to unravel. Chaos begins. The chaos didn't come all at once. It crept in, slowly at first, like the growing heat of a flame before it bursts into a full blaze. The world felt normal one moment, and the next, it was as if everything was unraveling. It started with a notification. My phone buzzed with an emergency alert, the kind you instinctively swipe away without reading. But this time the headline caught my attention. Evacuation warning, wildfire approaching Altadena. I froze. The words hit like a sharp gust of wind, scattering my thoughts. I glanced at the clock. It was 7:14 p.m. The fire had been a distant worry all day, something I believed the firefighters would contain. But now the flames were closer, and the reality of the situation was starting to set in. Evacuation orders begin. The official evacuation orders rolled in around 8 p.m. By then, the air had grown thick with smoke, turning the evening sky into a swirling mix of orange and gray. The Santa Ana winds, relentless and wild, carried the acrid smell of burning wood through the hills. Sirens pierced the air, growing louder and more frequent as fire trucks raced up the canyon roads. Neighbors began packing their cars, throwing suitcases, photo albums, and pets into the back seats. The usually quiet street outside Mama Ditake's cottage had turned into a scene of controlled chaos. Shadows of hurried figures moved in and out of houses, and headlights illuminated the swirling ash in the air. It was a different kind of chaos inside Mama Ditake's house, one fueled by stubbornness and love. The rest of the family had already gathered at her cottage, knowing she'd resist leaving. We knew her well enough to predict this would be a battle, and we weren't wrong. Mama Ditake's reluctance. "Mama D, you need to pack a bag," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rising panic in my chest. "The fire's getting closer. They've issued evacuation orders." She barely looked up from her armchair, sitting with Shadow curled in her lap. "I've lived here for 35 years and I've never had to evacuate," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "The hills protect us. Fires have never reached this far." Her words were meant to reassure us, but had the opposite effect. The calm in her tone felt misplaced, almost eerie, given the situation's urgency. I crouched in front of her, trying to meet her eyes. "Mama D, this isn't like the other fires. The winds are bad tonight. It's spreading faster than they can handle." She waved a hand dismissively, her face softening into a stubborn smile. "Oh, sweetheart, you worry too much. The fire crews know what they're doing. And besides," she winked, "this house has seen worse than a little smoke." I clenched my fists, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "This isn't just smoke, Mama D, look outside." I gestured toward the window, where the distant glow of the fire lit up the horizon. "We don't have time to argue about this," but she didn't budge. "It'll be fine," she said firmly, as if the words could keep the flames at bay. Fires have never reached us before. Internal conflict and rising tension. The family was split. My older brother, James, sided with Mama D, arguing that we were overreacting. "She's lived here longer than any of us," he said. "If she says it's safe, then it's safe." But I couldn't shake the unease in my gut. The air felt heavier with each passing moment, and the wind outside screamed like a living thing. "This isn't about being safe right now, it's about being smart," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "What if the fire shifts? What if we wait too long?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And what if we make her leave for nothing? She's not young, you know. The stress of leaving could be worse for her than staying." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. He wasn't wrong. Mama D wasn't just stubborn, she was fragile too. Her heart wasn't what it used to be, and even small stresses could take a toll on her. But leaving her here wasn't an option. It couldn't be. I turned back to her, my voice softening. "Mama D, please, do it for us. Even if you don't think the fire will come this way, just come with us to be safe." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I thought I'd gotten through to her. But then she shook her head, her expression unreadable. "This house is my life," she said quietly. Everything I've built, everything I've loved, it's all here. I can't leave it behind." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. My heart sank. The minutes were slipping away, and with them, our chances of getting her out safely. The fire draws closer. By 9 p.m., the fire was no longer a distant threat. The orange glow on the horizon had grown brighter and fiercer, and the ash in the air was so thick it coated everything like a layer of snow. The winds had picked up even more, whipping through the trees and carrying sparks that lit the night like fireflies. The evacuation orders had escalated from a warning to a mandatory order, but Mama D was still unmoved. "The hills will protect us," she repeated as if the words were a mantra. I stepped outside for air, but the sight that greeted me stopped me. The flames were closer than I'd realized, too close. My chest tightened as I stared at the approaching inferno, the heat already palpable even from a distance. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. Inside, the argument raged on. James was still trying to convince us to wait while I practically begged Mama D to leave. The tension was unbearable, which twists your stomach into knots and makes your thoughts spin out of control. "Mama D, if you stay here, you could die," I said finally, my voice breaking. "Please, I'm begging you." She looked at me then, her eyes softer than before. "I know you mean well," she said, reaching to take my hand. "But this is my home. If it's my time, it's my time. I've lived a good life." Her words hit me like a slap. The finality of them, the acceptance, was too much to bear. But before I could respond, we were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. The knock at the door, it was a firefighter, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Mama D, "you must evacuate now. The fire is moving faster than expected." "We don't have time to argue." For a moment, she hesitated. I saw the conflict in her eyes, the tug-of-war between her love for her home and the reality of the danger. But then, to my surprise, she nodded. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll go." Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. As we scrambled to pack up a few essentials, the fire roared closer, its heat now undeniable. The wind howled like a warning, carrying the unmistakable crackle of flames. Time was running out. A moment too late, we were almost ready to leave when the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. Panic set in as we fumbled with flashlights, trying to gather the last of our belongings. Mama D clutched Shadow to her chest, her face pale but determined. But as we stepped outside, the fire was already there, a wall of flames cutting off the road. The heat was suffocating, the smoke blinding, and in that moment I realized the terrible truth. We'd waited too long, trapped by circumstances. The chaos didn't give us a choice. It forced us into decisions we'd question for the rest of our lives. It's strange how, in the moment, everything feels rushed, yet time stretches unbearably thin. You think you're doing the right thing, that you're making the best call with the information you have. But sometimes, what feels like the right decision at the time becomes the one you regret forever. The day had already been a whirlwind. Between the evacuation orders and Mama Ditake's stubborn refusal to leave her home, our nerves were frayed. The fire wasn't just a distant threat anymore. It was an unpredictable monster creeping closer with every passing moment. And yet, even as panic began to set in, there was a part of me that clung to hope. Mama D had lived through countless fires in the hills. She'd seen the winds howl and the smoke rise, and her home had always been spared. I wanted so desperately to believe she was right this time, too. The first mistake the day had been exhausting, physically and emotionally. By early evening, after hours of back-and-forth arguments about whether to leave, the tension in the house was palpable. Mama D had dug in her heels, insisting she wasn't going anywhere. My brother James was on her side, convinced we were overreacting. I was the only one still pleading for her to pack a bag and leave with us. And then, as if things weren't chaotic enough, my phone buzzed with a call from my sister, Beth. She was at work across town and had just gotten news about our uncle, Mama Ditake's younger brother, who'd been admitted to the hospital with chest pains. His condition wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough that Beth thought someone from the family should go. "Can you head to the hospital?" she asked, her voice tight with urgency. "I can't leave work right now, and I don't know who else to call." I hesitated. The fire was still miles away, but the thought of leaving Mama D in this situation didn't sit right with me. I glanced at her, sitting calmly in her armchair as if the world wasn't falling apart around us. She noticed my hesitation and waved me off. "Go," she said firmly. "Your uncle needs you. I'll be fine here with James. The fire isn't coming this way." Her confidence should have reassured me, but it didn't. I argued with myself in those seconds, torn between staying and going. In the end, the urgency of my sister's call went out. I grabbed my bag, kissed Mama D on the forehead, and told her I'd be back soon. "If anything changes, call me," I said. She smiled and nodded the way she always did when she thought I was worrying too much. The hospital visit, the drive to the hospital, was surreal. The sun had dipped below the horizon, but the sky was still aglow with an eerie orange light. The smoke in the air was thicker now, making the outlines of the hills look like they were smudged in charcoal. The roads were eerily quiet, save for the occasional fire truck speeding past, sirens blaring. When I arrived at the hospital, the scene inside was chaotic. It seemed like half the city had shown up, seeking treatment for smoke inhalation, burns, or sheer panic. Nurses and doctors moved quickly through the packed halls, their faces grim but focused. I found my uncle in a small, crowded room, hooked up to a monitor but stable. He greeted me with a weak smile, his voice raspy from the oxygen mask. "Didn't mean to pull you away," he said, his words labored. "But it's good to see you." I sat with him for a while, updating him on Mama D and the fire. He nodded, his expression softening when I told him she was as stubborn as ever. "That's Maggie for you," he said with a chuckle. "She won't leave unless she absolutely has to." I tried to stay present, but my mind kept drifting back to her cottage. I checked my phone constantly, hoping for an update from James or Mama D herself. There was nothing. I told myself it was a good sign, that no news meant everything was fine. But the uneasy feeling in my chest only grew heavier. The separation by the time I left the hospital, it was nearing midnight. The air outside was suffocating, thick with smoke that burned my eyes and lungs. The wind had picked up, howling through the streets like a warning. The orange glow on the horizon was brighter now, more menacing. My stomach twisted as I realized the fire was much closer than it had been just a few hours ago. I called James as I started the car. The line rang twice before he picked up. His voice was calm, almost bored, which only made me more anxious. "Everything's fine," he said. "Mama D Teke's asleep. I'm keeping an eye on the news, but it looks like the fire's still a good distance away. Are you sure?" I pressed. "It looks bad from here." "I'm sure," he said, his tone dismissive. "You worry too much." I hung up, but the conversation did nothing to ease my nerves. The drive back to Altadena felt longer than usual, the roads darker and emptier than I'd ever seen them. The closer I got to the hills, the more oppressive the heat became. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and I found myself holding my breath without realizing it. Signs of trouble. As I approached Mama D Teke's neighborhood, I noticed the power was out. The streetlights that usually lit the way were dark, leaving the roads in near total darkness. The only illumination came from the fire, its glow now terrifyingly close. I turned onto her street, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I saw it. The shadowy outline of James's car speeding down the road in the opposite direction. I slammed on the brakes and rolled down my window, waving frantically to get his attention. He stopped, his face pale and frantic as he leaned out of the driver's side window. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "Where's Mama D?" "She wouldn't come," he said, his voice trembling. "I tried, but she wouldn't leave. I couldn't wait anymore. The fire's too close." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You left her there?" I yelled, disbelief and anger boiling over. "You left her alone. She wouldn't come," he repeated, his voice cracking. "She told me to go. I didn't have a choice." I didn't wait for him to say more. I slammed my car into reverse, turned around, and sped toward the house. The final moments, the closer I got, the clearer it became that we'd made a terrible mistake. The fire was no longer a distant glow. It was a wall of flames, roaring and crackling as it devoured everything in its path. The heat was unbearable, even from inside the car. My heart raced as I pulled into the driveway, the flames casting long, flickering shadows across the front of the house. I jumped out of the car and ran to the door, shouting Mama D Teke's name. The air was thick with smoke, making it hard to see or breathe. I pounded on the door, praying she was inside and would answer, but there was no response. I fumbled for my phone, trying to call her, but the line went straight to voicemail. Panic surged through me as I realized I might already be too late. If only we'd known what was coming, I thought, my chest tightening with regret. If only we'd stayed. The fire approaches. The fire didn't rush in like a thief at night. It crept forward like a predator, silent and calculating. It claimed everything in its path, moving steadily, relentlessly, as though it had all the time in the world. What began as a distant glow on the horizon had transformed into a firewall, roaring and alive, hungry for more. The smoke came first. It rolled in like a thick, suffocating fog, choking the air and blurring the edges of everything it touched. It wasn't just the smell of burning wood, the acrid sting of destruction, a cocktail of charred earth, scorched plastic, and smoldering memories. Once painted in soft twilight hues, the sky now swirled with ash and embers, a chaotic canvas of despair. The world outside the hills surrounding Mama D Teke's cottage had always been a sanctuary, her refuge from the noise and chaos of the outside world. But now those same hills had become a battleground. The flames climbed their slopes with terrifying precision, leaping from one dry tree to the next faster than anyone could have imagined. The wind howled through the canyon, fanning the flames and sending burning embers flying through the night like fiery snowflakes. The silence between the gusts of wind was even more unnerving. The kind of silence made the crackling of the fire sound louder, sharper, like a living, breathing thing. It was as if the world held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Mama Diteke's last hours. Mama D sat by the window inside her little cottage, her face illuminated by the flickering orange glow outside. Shadow, her faithful cat, curled in her lap, his ears twitching at every distant pop and crack. The power had gone out hours ago, leaving the house bathed in darkness, save for the dim light of the fire and the single candle she'd lit on the coffee table. She wasn't scared, at least not in the way most people would be. Mama D had lived a long life, and fear wasn't something she gave into quickly. But there was a weight in her chest, a heaviness that came from the realization that she might not have much time left. She looked around the room, her eyes lingering on the things that had filled her life with so much joy. The paintings on the walls, the journals stacked neatly on her desk, and the wind chimes that hung by the window. Did she think about leaving? Did she wonder if it was still possible to escape, or did she know deep down that it was too late? Mama D wasn't the type to panic. She would have sat there, steady and calm, weighing her options. Maybe she stood at the window, watching the flames inch closer, the shadows dancing on the walls like ghosts. Perhaps she thought about calling for help, but her phone had long since died and the roads were likely impassable. She must have known that she was on her own. The flames get closer, the heat was unbearable, even inside the house. The air grew thick and heavy, every breath a struggle. The flames were no longer a distant glow. They were a living, breathing entity, their roar filling the night like a terrible symphony. The fire's light flickered through the windows, casting long, ominous shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as if they were alive. A shadow stirred in her lap, his tail flicking nervously. Mama D ran a hand down his back, her touch steady despite the chaos outside. "It's all right, baby," she whispered, unsure if she was reassuring him or herself. She stroked him gently, her eyes fixed on the fire creeping ever closer. The wind outside howled again, this time louder, more desperate, as if it were warning her of what would come. The house creaked and groaned, the old wood straining against the heat. The familiar sound of her home was now laced with something ominous, something threatening. What did she think about in those critical hours? Did Mama D think about her family? About us? Did she regret not leaving when she had the chance? Or did she feel a sense of peace, knowing she was surrounded by the things she loved most? She probably thought about the times we'd spent together, summers in her backyard, the book club gatherings, the way her laughter used to fill every corner of the house. Maybe she thought about her children, grandchildren, and the legacy she'd leave behind. Did she wonder if we were safe? Did she hope we'd forgive her for staying behind, for being so stubborn? Or did she believe, even in those final moments, that the house would protect her the way it always had? And then there was the fire itself. Did she fear it? Or did she see it as something beautiful, unstoppable, and wild, a force of nature that couldn't be tamed? Mama D had always respected nature, even when it was most dangerous. Maybe she saw the flames not as her enemy, but as an inevitable part of life. The final moments, the fire reached the edge of her property just after midnight. It moved quickly, devouring the trees and shrubs in its path. The wind carried embers onto the roof, where they smoldered for a moment before bursting into flame. The wooden beams of the porch caught fire. Next, the flames licked at the front door like a hungry beast. Inside, the heat was unbearable. The house's walls, once a sanctuary, had become a furnace. The air was thick with smoke, and every breath burned. The wind chimes on the porch jingled weakly, their sound muffled by the roar of the flames. Mama D didn't run. She didn't panic. She stayed where she was, her back straight, her hands steady. She'd faced so much in her life and wasn't about to cower now. She held Shadow close, whispering soothing words as the fire consumed everything around her. And then, the fire was there, the flames broke through the windows, shattering the glass with a deafening crash. The room was filled with smoke and light, the air crackling with heat and electricity. The fire wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside, alive, consuming everything in its path, and in that moment, everything changed. The world she knew was gone, replaced by a wall of flame and smoke. The wind howled one last time, carrying the sound of the fire's roar and the faint jingle of wind chimes. And then the fire was there. The discovery, the moment we pulled up to what was left of Mama Diteke's cottage. Time seemed to stop. The world around us felt muted, like all the noise and chaos from the fire had drained away, leaving only an overwhelming stillness. Smoke hung heavy in the air, curling upward in thin, ghostly tendrils, and the sky was a sickly shade of gray. What had once been a place of warmth and laughter, a home that had stood strong for decades, was now unrecognizable. The cheerful blue shutters Mama D had painted herself were gone, replaced by scorched, skeletal remains of the walls. Once alive with wildflowers and herbs, her garden was nothing more than smoldering earth. None of us spoke. We couldn't. The weight of what we saw was too much to put into words. It was as if speaking aloud would make it all real, and we were not ready. The dreaded news we had held on to hope even as the fire roared through the hills. I hope Mama D had somehow escaped and was safe at one of the evacuation centers, waiting for us with her signature smile and a witty remark about how she'd showed those flames who's boss. But as we stood there, staring at the ruins of her home, that hope began to crumble. A firefighter approached us, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion. He held his helmet under one arm, his eyes downcast as he approached. The way he hesitated before speaking told us everything we needed to know. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the faint crackling of the remaining embers. "We found remains. They were inside the house." The words hit like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I staggered back, my hand flying to my mouth as tears blurred my vision. James, who had been so stoic up until now, cried and sank to his knees. Beth clung to my arm, her sobs muffled against my shoulder. She didn't make it. I managed to choke out, though the question felt pointless. I already knew the answer. The firefighter shook his head, his expression heavy with sympathy. "It appears she stayed until the very end." "I'm so sorry for your loss." The aftermath, the scene around us, was a haunting reminder of what the fire had taken. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt wood and melted metal. Ash coated everything, turning the ground into a gray, powdery wasteland. The heat from the fire lingered in the air, radiating off the charred remains of the house. The devastation became even more apparent as we moved closer to the ruins. The roof had collapsed, leaving only jagged beams sticking up like broken bones. The furniture inside was reduced to unrecognizable piles of ash and debris. And yet, amidst all the destruction, there were tiny, heartbreaking remnants of the life Mama D had built there. Though blackened and bent, her wind chimes swayed weakly in the breeze, their faint jingle barely audible. A piece of her favorite armchair poked out from the rubble, its floral fabric singed but still recognizable. Near what had once been her kitchen, we found the charred remains of her journal, the edges burned but the middle pages miraculously intact. It was too much to bear. Every small item we recognized felt like a dagger to the heart, a cruel reminder of the vibrant life that had once filled this place. The final message as we sifted through the wreckage, desperate for anything that could give us closure, one of the firefighters called out to us. "I think you'll want to see this," he said, holding up a small, scorched object. It was Mama Ditake's phone. The screen was cracked and the edges were melted, but it still worked. My hands trembled as I took it from him, my heart pounding. With shaking fingers, I unlocked the phone and opened her voice memos. At the top of the list was a recording dated the night of the fire. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the play button. Part of me wasn't sure if I could handle hearing her voice, knowing it would be the last time. But the others urged me on, their tear-streaked faces filled with the same desperate need for answers. I pressed play. "If you're hearing this." "I guess I didn't make it out," she began, her voice carrying that familiar warmth that made everything feel okay, even in the worst moments. "But don't you dare feel guilty. I made my choice and I don't regret it." Her voice trembled slightly, but she stayed composed. "This house, this life I've built here, it's been my everything. And if it's my time, then so be it. I've lived a good life, surrounded by love and laughter. That's more than most people get." There was a pause and we could hear the fire roaring closer in the background. "I just want you all to know how much I love you, every single one of you, and if I have any regrets, I didn't get to say goodbye properly." Her tone shifted then, becoming quieter, almost wistful. "There's something about fire, something wild and untamed. It reminds me of life in a way. Beautiful, unpredictable, and impossible to control. Maybe that's why I stayed, to face it, to see it for what it is." The recording ended with a whisper, "Take care of each other, and don't cry for me, I'm where I'm meant to be." A gift in the ashes. By the time the recording finished, we were all in tears. Her words were like a balm for our shattered hearts, giving us the desperately needed closure. Even in her final moments, Mama D had left us with something precious, her voice, love, and unwavering strength. In the middle of it all, she left behind one last gift, I whispered, clutching the phone to my chest. A message that broke our hearts, but also healed them. As I looked around at the ruins of her home, I realized that the fire hadn't taken everything. It hadn't taken her spirit, love, or the memories we'd built here. Those things were ours to carry forward, no matter what. Mama Ditake's final words when I found her final message, the world stopped spinning. Time, the chaos around me, and even my breath seemed to freeze. The phone, scorched and battered by the fire, had survived just like Mama D herself always seemed to endure. It was a minor miracle that her voice was still waiting for us amid all this devastation. With shaking hands, I pressed play. And for the last time I heard the woman's voice who had shaped my world. The message, her voice was calm, steady, and heartbreakingly familiar, even with the faint crackling of fire and the howl of wind in the background. If you're hearing this, well, I guess you already know what's happened. Her words came softly at first, like she didn't want to scare us. I'm sorry I couldn't get out, I really tried, but the fire came so fast, faster than I ever thought it could. There was a pause and we could hear her taking a deep breath, trying to stay composed. But don't you dare blame yourselves, not for 1 second, you hear me? I made my choice and it was mine to make. Her tone shifted then, carrying the warmth we all knew so well. I want you to know that I lived a good life, a full life. I loved and was loved. I got to see all of you grow into such incredible people. And I'm proud, I'm so proud. Her words were like a hug, wrapping us in the comfort of her love even as tears streamed down our faces. I know you're probably crying right now, she said, a faint laugh escaping through her voice. And that's okay. Cry if you need to, but don't let the sadness take over. Don't let it stop you from living, because life is beautiful even when it's hard, and I want you to live it for me, for all of us. In the background, we could hear the fire growing louder. The crackling of flames was unmistakable, but her voice remained steady. I don't know how much time I have left, she continued, her tone softening. But I want you to promise me something. Promise me you'll take care of each other, that you'll laugh and love and be kind even when it feels impossible. That's what life is about, isn't it? Her words grew quieter, tinged with a hint of fear she couldn't entirely hide. I'm not going to lie, I'm scared, but I'm not alone. I've got Shadow here with me, and I've got all of you in my heart. And that's enough. Another pause. The sound of her breathing came through, steady but heavier now. You'll be okay, she whispered. I know you will. Be strong, my loves, for me. The recording ended with a faint, whispered goodbye, and just like that, her voice was gone. A wave of emotion, the silence that followed was unbearable. The absence of her voice and the finality of those words was like losing her all over again. I clutched the phone to my chest, tears streaming down my face as her message played on repeat in my mind. James was the first to speak, his voice cracking under his grief. She wasn't afraid, he said, though the tears in his eyes betrayed the truth. She was stronger than any of us. Beth was sobbing quietly, her head buried in her hands. She didn't deserve this, she whispered. She deserved more time. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that Mama D had lived a whole life just as she said. But the words caught in my throat, blocked by the unbearable ache in my chest. All I could do was sit there, holding the phone, wishing for just one more chance to hear her laugh, feel her arms around me, and tell her how much she meant to me. The gift of her words. As the hours passed, her words began to sink in, their meaning unfolding like petals in the aftermath of a storm. She hadn't just left us a goodbye, she'd left us a guide, a reminder of what mattered most. Her message was more than her final words, it was a testament to her life and the love she'd given so freely. Don't let the sadness take over, she'd said. It was easier said than done, of course. But in those dark moments, her words were like a light, pulling us out of the depths of our grief and reminding us of the joy she'd brought into our lives. Mama D had always been the heart of our family, the one who held us together even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. And now, even in her absence, she was still doing that. Her words were her final gift to us, a way to keep her spirit alive in our hearts. Reflecting on her resilience, I thought about how calm she sounded, even as the fire raged around her. She could have spent those final moments in fear, but chose love instead. She chose us. It was such a Mama D thing to do, turning even the darkest moment into something meaningful, something beautiful. Her resilience wasn't surprising. Mama D had faced so much in her life, loss, hardship, and challenges most people couldn't imagine. But she never let those things define her. She faced every trial with grace and strength, finding joy in even the smallest moments. Her final words reflected who she'd always been. A woman who loved deeply, lived fully, and never stopped believing in the beauty of life. The duality of closure, hearing her voice again, brought a bittersweet kind of closure. It was comforting to know that she hadn't been alone and spent her final moments thinking of us. But it also broke our hearts to see that she was truly gone, that we'd never hear that voice again outside of a recording. Grief is strange like that. It's a constant push and pull, a battle between holding on and letting go. Mama D's message didn't erase the pain of losing her, but it gave us something to hold on to, something that felt like hope. Carrying her legacy as I sat there, replaying her message again, I realized something. Mama D's story wasn't over. It lived on in every word she'd spoken, every memory she'd left behind, and every life she'd touched. Her final words weren't just a goodbye, but a call to action. A reminder to live with the kind of love and courage she had always shown us. To laugh, to cry, to embrace life's beauty and pain in equal measure. Be strong, she'd said, and we would be, for her, for each other. Lessons from the fire took so much from us. It burned homes to the ground, claimed lives, and left scars that may never fully heal. But amidst the ashes, it also left us with lessons, harsh, unrelenting truths about life, love, and the fragility of everything we hold dear. The biggest lesson: life is unpredictable. The world feels steady one moment, and everything shifts beneath your feet the next. The fire didn't care about boundaries or plans. It came without warning, devouring everything in its path, and left us grappling with questions we'll never fully answer. What if we'd acted sooner? What if we'd stayed by Mama Ditake's side? What if? But the truth is, hindsight doesn't change the past. It only teaches us how to move forward. The importance of preparation. The fire also taught us the importance of being prepared, not just for ourselves, but for those we love, especially the elderly. Mama D wasn't the only one who struggled to act in time. Many elderly residents like her were hesitant to leave their homes. Some didn't hear the evacuation alerts because they weren't tech-savvy or didn't use their phones regularly. Others simply underestimated the fire's speed and ferocity. Her story became more than a personal loss, a wake-up call for us all. It forced us to confront the gaps in our emergency response systems, particularly when it comes to vulnerable populations. Since the fire, local communities have started advocating for better evacuation protocols, including door-to-door alerts and improved resources for those who might struggle to evacuate quickly. It's not just about saving lives, it's about giving everyone, regardless of age or ability, a fighting chance. A personal reckoning for me. The fire forced a personal reckoning. Mama Ditake's last message echoed in my mind constantly. Be strong, don't let the sadness take over. She wouldn't want us to live in fear, but she also wouldn't want us to forget the lessons her life and her death taught us. The unpredictability of life doesn't have to paralyze us. Instead, it should motivate us to be present, prepare, and hold our loved ones closer. Because when everything else falls away, love and connection are what truly matter. Tribute to Mama D. Mama D wasn't just our family's matriarch, she was its heart and soul. Her life was a testament to resilience, humor, and unwavering love, and even in her absence, she continues to inspire us. Celebrating her strength, Mama D wasn't just strong, she was unshakable. Life threw countless challenges her way, from raising 2 kids on her own after losing her husband to building a home that became a sanctuary for anyone who needed it. Yet through it all, she never let the weight of her struggles dim her spirit. She had this incredible ability to find humor in even the darkest situations. Once, during a power outage, she turned her living room into a makeshift campfire, lighting candles and roasting marshmallows over the gas stove. If life gives you darkness, she'd said with a grin, make s'mores. Her sense of humor wasn't just about making people laugh, it reminded us that there's always a reason to smile, even in tough times. A community's support after the fire, the outpouring of support from the community was overwhelming. Neighbors who had known Mama D for years came together to honor her memory. They brought flowers, shared stories, and offered their help in ways big and small. One neighbor, Juan, recounted how Mama D once showed up at his door with a plate of cookies after his wife passed away. She didn't say much, he told us, tears in his eyes. She just sat with me. Sometimes that's all you need, someone who cares enough just to be there. Even strangers, people who had heard her story through the news, reached out with messages of sympathy and admiration. She sounds like the kind of woman we all hope to become, one note read. And she was a legacy of love. Mama Ditake's legacy is one of love. Love for her family, friends, community, and even the world around her. She taught us that resilience isn't about avoiding pain or hardship, it's about facing it with courage and finding beauty in the little things. I think of her whenever I see the wind chimes swaying in the breeze. Every time I hear the rustling of leaves or the faint jingle of those chimes, I feel her presence. And every time I sit down to journal, bake cookies, or simply take a moment to breathe, I feel like I'm carrying a piece of her. Conclusion: Mama Ditake's story wasn't just about loss, it was about life. It was about the connections we build, the love we share, and the strength we find when everything else disappears. Her last message wasn't just for us, it was for anyone who has loved and lost, for anyone who has faced the uncertainty of life and found the courage to keep going. Her words echo in my heart every day. Be strong, don't let the sadness take over. If there's one thing I've learned from this tragedy, life is fleeting. We never know how much time we have with the people we love, so we have to make the most of it. Tell your family you love them. Reach out to that friend you haven't spoken to in years, and prepare, because while we can't predict the future, we can take steps to protect the people who matter most. Mama D always believed life was about finding joy, even amid hardship, and she was right. We can't always control what happens, but we can control how we respond. we can choose to live with love, resilience, and hope.